Open mouth, already a mistake. That's a Zen saying that conveys the maddening impossibility of talking accurately about the deeper issues in a straightforward way. But I'm going to charge ahead anyway and get into some of that deeper water as I talk about revolution within the mind as a common factor in psychedelic experience, madness, and spiritual awakening. My name's Ron Unger, and I'm speaking to you from where I live in Eugene, Oregon, in the USA. I do want to briefly acknowledge that this land I reside on has been the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. Anyway, in the last couple decades, the work I've been doing here in Eugene is being a therapist for people who are experiencing what is now usually called psychosis, more traditionally called madness. But before that, I had my own experience of being immersed in that state. So let me tell you a little about how that happened. This slide shows multiple arrows pointing inward and then the figure of a human head with arrows pointing in all different directions within it. That's representing how multiple bits of challenging experience and contradictory influence can lead to inner confusion. Now, as with lots of people who become mad, my problem started with overtly traumatic experience. I was abused at home, then bullied at school, and then there was my experience of gradually realizing I was gay, but living in a very heterosexist world. These experiences induced in me a system of meaning in which I saw myself as an inferior being existing in a hostile world. So these experiences created a state of oppression, and being oppressed sets the stage for revolution. But to really get the revolution going, there needs to be a spark that sets it off. In my case, that spark came in the form of my first LSD trip. During that trip, I encountered some beings that let me know that things and experiences didn't have to mean what they had come to mean for me. And that if I wanted, I could develop a completely different sense of myself and of the world. Now, a lot of people go through psychedelic trips and then they come down and say, oh, it wasn't that fun, but it might not change them that much. But for me, I made it my goal to reorganize my life around the discoveries I'd made on that trip. I do find it interesting that a key theme in psychosis is the loss of a sense of self and the loss of contact with a previous sense of reality. But my sense at the time was of desperately wanting to get rid of my previous sense of self and to get rid of my previous sense of reality because they'd been so oppressive. So I now embarked on a journey outside of what I'd previously known as reality. And I did quickly become aware that one way of framing what I was going through was as a psychosis or madness. And that's both because others sometimes told me I seemed to be psychotic or schizophrenic, and because I was studying psychology and reading about the similar experiences of others. But fortunately, though, I was also reading people like R.D. Laing, who understood that madness has the possibility of being a positive journey or something spiritual. One of my favorite sayings during while working through those experiences came from an Alfred Jarry character who said, God or myself created all possible universes. They coexist, but most men can barely see one of them. I did come to see myself as one with God or as God trying to bring another way of being into existence. And I also very much wanted to communicate my insights about all that to others. It's said that mad people often think that they're prophets. But if you think about it, the big distinction between mad people and prophets is that prophets have followers. But finding followers wasn't easy for me. For a few years, I had just one friend who I could really make sense to, but eventually I alienated him as well. Fortunately for me, though, around that time, a childhood friend of my younger brother named John Law came out to visit me, and he ended up staying around. He'd recently just gotten out of psych ward where he'd been treated for psychosis. So for some time, we were just sharing our visions with each other. But then I heard about this newly forming group called the San Francisco Suicide Club. And that club was about people getting together to create our own meaning and reality, to create playful and sometimes bizarre worlds within a bigger world we saw as kind of dead or oppressive. Within this group, anybody could lead an event. So now John and I could have followers. So John actually took that group much more avidly than I did. He became an important leader in that club and then in the Cacophony Society. And he's recognized as a co-founder of Burning Man for his work in bringing that event to Nevada. though he did bail on Burning Man when it got big enough to require rules. But anyway, this slide has an image of the cover of the book that John co-authored that tells the story of this. But one thing I can say about my own experience during that time is that as I tried to have followers and make sense to followers, I found people were interested in what I had to share, but I had to organize myself to become more coherent in order to make sense to them. And as I did so, I was less likely to come across as psychotic or on the edge of psychosis. And then I was able to relate better with people as I went on with my life. So since I came through this experience well, it left me in a better place than where I started. It's easy for me to frame what happened as a positive mental revolution or as a spiritual and creative awakening. But later I saw several of my younger siblings enter into similar kinds of mental disruptions, only they did end up falling into the mental health system that told them that what they were experiencing was just a serious mental illness. So one big question is, why does our mental health system frame things that way? Now, to put it simply, psychiatry says that someone is psychotic if they're perceiving or believing something that's both culturally abnormal and is causing serious problems in functioning. It typically refuses to consider the possibility that an experience could be culturally abnormal, cause big problems in functioning at some point, as my experience did, but still be valuable in important ways, especially once people sort it out. When anyone brings up this possibility, they're typically accused of romanticizing psychosis. Now, I have run into people who do seem to romanticize psychosis, and that's unbalanced, you know. But it seems to me that most of the mental health system is also unbalanced by only wanting to look at the negative side of these experiences, which we could call awfulizing experiences or pathologizing them. Now, actually, if you look at the origin story of modern religions, you see that their founders had typically a time of crisis early on, like Muhammad contemplating suicide when the angel first contacted him, or Jesus tempted by the devil to throw himself off a pinnacle, or Buddha being tormented by demons. And as the film Crazy Wise documents, in indigenous societies, those who are called to be shamans often first fall spontaneously into some kind of crisis state. Now, one way some people have tried to challenge psychiatry is to introduce the concept of spiritual emergency. And this is often introduced by claiming that there's a categorical distinction between people who are truly psychotic and those who are just having a difficult time with spiritual awakening. The thought is that people that are having spiritual emergency really need help with getting through the awakening process, while those with psychosis may think that they're having a spiritual experience, but with them, the problem is really just illness, and what they need is just standard treatment with drugs and attempts to suppress the symptoms. The really big problem with that way of thinking, though, is that we don't have any clear criteria for making such distinctions. One study where they tried, it was just a mess. Way too many experiences came up as intermediate. Also, it seems that it's not so much the experiences themselves, but what people make of the experience that determines whether those experiences contribute to growth or not. And what people make of the experience is in turn affected by the context they're in and how others relate to the experience and teach them to relate to the experience. A key thing here is that framing someone's experience as nothing but illness can actually become part of what impairs people's ability to relate to themselves and their experience. So it can become part of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people define their experience as illness, then they may become less able to find anything of value in it, to make anything of it. So what I'm proposing is to take a point of view that's more complex than the mental illness versus spiritual emergency perspective. I think it's better to recognize there may be a continuum of how experiences occur. Some experiences do seem to more obviously to have something helpful and positive in them, even though they may also have some difficulties or rocky points. Other experiences seem much darker and destructive, but it's still possible that something in those experiences will become important in a person's development. We just don't always know where a person's process is going to lead. And as Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. the process of experimenting with how to understand and relate to tricky experience is what we need to keep going with to help people eventually get to a good place. So this slide shows people worshiping a golden calf, and the caption asks, is stability a false god of the mental health system? My answer would be yes, it is. I think instead we do best when we're existing on an edge between stability and instability. And sometimes what we need most is a new vision that overthrows a prior stability. Now, this rigidity of the mental health system did not just come out of nowhere. Um, as societies develop, they often become more rigid, and then altered states become seen as a threat. This slide shows how the pendulum can swing then and how society might respond to such a threat. On one side, it shows someone being tortured under the Inquisition. At the point in history when the Inquisition occurred, Europe was becoming much less tolerant of those seen as mentally different. It just framed such people as spiritually evil. And then the other side shows the pendulum swinging to our modern era, where madness is usually framed as not being about anything spiritual at all. It's just understood to be an illness. And as the picture shows, pharma can sometimes be the only tool. It's like a hammer. So the patient becomes like the nail. It's interesting to me historically that it was a spiritual teacher who took the lead in advocating for the swing towards framing madness and illness, but she did so for a good reason. Hearing voices had been traditionally seen in Europe as being a spiritual event. But when the Inquisition came to the convent, where Teresa of Avila oversaw some nuns who heard voices, she defended the nuns by introducing the idea that their voice hearing was being caused by an illness. I think the better alternative is for society to simply be less rigid and to be open to the possibility of experiences that go outside the norm. But when an existing form of social order is too full of itself, it should always have the power, and it denies any need for renewal or exploring other points of view. But as JFK once pointed out, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And I think one reason revolution is such a good metaphor for madness is that revolutions can go in so many different directions. They can both lead to something good and they can lead to absolute horror. Now, often in the beginning of a revolution, there can be a kind of euphoria. With the existing order overthrown, anything seems possible. But there's a catch. Without a form of order in place, anything terrible becomes possible as well. Then fear can lead to efforts to reimpose an old order or reimpose some new kind of order that only parts of the psyche support. Then you can possibly get into a prolonged internal civil war. And then outsiders can come in and try to impose their ideas of what the order should be and just often cause more battling and more fighting. What we really need are peacemakers. Now, peacemaking requires seeing the value in all sides, including the sides that are attached to certain forms of order and those who want to disrupt that order to make room for something new. So that requires that balance between pathologizing and romanticizing any particular side in the conflict. I'd like to say just a little about the possible role of psychedelics in mental revolution. This slide compares the connectivity of the typical resting mind with that of the mind influenced by psychedelics. As you can see, the psychedelic mind has way more connections. This can also be understood as the mind experimenting with many different kinds of meaning. So it's overthrowing the idea that there's only one way of looking at things. And then once the person comes down, of course, what they do with those meanings can vary a lot. But this idea of many meanings is also seen in psychosis and spiritual awakening in general. But I think you often see these two polarities. One is that polarity of opening up to new meanings. It's also part of psychedelic experience. But then there's also the polarity of becoming really firm or even rigid around particular meanings. So on the one hand, there's this experience of being very open or uncertain. A person may see so many meanings that it becomes just uncertain what anything is. you get to this place by questioning everything. And on the one hand, it's a very free place. You're free of any fixed meaning. But on the other hand, you can feel totally vulnerable. You can feel completely disoriented and threatened. And to deal with that, you might try finding something to be certain about. You can quit questioning and find a way to have faith or certainty. You can have then a definite sense of meaning, but depending on what you settle on, you might come across as having now rigid, crazy ideas. Now, when people are more psychotic, they can swing wildly between these two extremes, or they can do things like identify with one extreme out of fear of the other. There's often a war between opposites, a war between good and evil. But people can also learn to live more peacefully within the sea of all possible meanings, and even understand that opposite extremes arise mutually. Joseph Campbell, for example, said that the psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight. So one way of drawing this all together is with this model of the renewal process. And this slide shows 3 stages. The first is the state of mind before the revolution. At this stage, there can be some kind of important problem that cannot be solved within the constructs or system of meaning that currently exists. And this causes the person to question things and to jump into that sea of possible alternative meanings. It causes them to go out of their mind or get outside the box. At this point, they may also be grasping onto alternative meanings, and then suddenly sometimes they're holding onto them very rigidly, the way a drowning person might do. And with bad luck or no help or the wrong kind of help, a person might stay stuck in this kind of floundering for years or even the rest of their life. But if they get the right kind of help and have some luck, they can then emerge from that process and form a system of meaning that may in some ways be superior to that which they had preceding the disorder. One thing we can draw from this model is the idea that recovery from madness should not be framed as a return to the state that preceded it, because there was something wrong with that earlier state, and the plunge into the renewal process was an attempt to correct it. Recovery from madness is a return to balance, but to a new kind of balance. This slide compares a fully resolved psychosis or renewal process with the metamorphosis of a butterfly. As the slide says, they both entail an initial stage of profound disintegration, and they both entail eventual reintegration into a form that has capacities not present in the earlier form. So if we take everything I've been talking about seriously, then how will mental health treatment and actually our whole society be changed? First, we cease framing normality and stability as being sure signs of health. We might instead recognize, as my friend and psychiatric survivor David Oak says, that normal people are destroying the planet. And then we might recognize that there can be value in people sometimes breaking away from normal, even in challenging or sometimes distressing ways, and people undergoing a process of mental revolution, and then contact with the deeper mysteries, and then possibly renewal. It will see its role as protecting and supporting both the person and the process so that people can navigate this successfully. I'm suggesting this be done not just for the benefit of those who slip into confusion or madness, but for the benefit of all of us. Because when our culture is too sure of fixed forms of meaning, and when it fails to see the limits of the fixed forms that we have, then all of us can easily become stuck in patterns that can become deadly. We're better off seeking to assist those who wander outside the cultural box and who experiment with other forms of meaning. Then we can support the development of successful prophets or shamans or cultural innovators, the people we need to keep cultural evolution moving forward. I do believe our survival depends upon developing a better relationship with mental revolution and visionary experience. So thanks for listening and considering this, and I look forward to hearing your questions and having discussion.